All right. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about hooks and components. So here's the topics we're going to be covering today. We're going to be starting off with hooks. We'll be covering what is the virtual DOM, useState, how to manipulate the items within useState, specifically talking with arrays. We're going to be talking about useEffect, what is a dependency list within useEffect, how to utilize useEffect to make API calls, conditional rendering, and we'll be talking about components and props. So we'll talk about what is a component, why do we need components, project structure, creating a component, exporting files, and different ways to export those files, the parent to child relationship, what are props, not what is props, and then prop destructuring. With all that said, does anyone have any questions about anything that I will be going over today? All right. If there are no questions, then let's go ahead and move into the virtual DOM. So we know what the DOM is, right? We've seen the DOM before. The DOM stands for the document object model, and it's just the way that JavaScript interacts with our actual HTML in order to create content. According to the assignments that we've done over the last couple of days, both during the full stack week and yesterday when we made our first React projects, we're utilizing JavaScript to actually interact with document.createElement. We're creating elements to the JavaScript DOM and then appending those elements over to our HTML file by either grabbing a specific division or some sort of HTML tag by ID and then appending children into it. Well, that works great. But that's not how React is meant to be utilized, right? Because if we were just doing that over and over again, then at that point, why even utilize the React framework? Well, today we're going to talk about something called the virtual DOM. So when React actually renders an application, it takes the DOM and makes a copy of it. And then that copy gets placed kind of out of our control, right? We don't have an actual interaction with it. It's just called the virtual DOM. And this is where the magic of React kind of starts happening, right? So we have our DOM, which is what actually gets rendered on the screen. And then we have our virtual DOM, which completely interacts with our code and what's happening within our code. What is it that our code is trying to make the DOM look like? So for example, if we change a state value within the virtual DOM, which is our actual code, all right, if at some point we have some sort of, let's say this H1 header here, right? This H1 header says, hello, Victor. But then at some point in our code, we tell it, hey, instead of saying hello, Victor, if these specific conditions are met, I want you to say goodbye, Victor. So the application renders. After the application renders, something in our code, maybe it's some sort of useEffect or something that's altering the state, is saying, okay, well, if, or maybe it's an onClick function, so saying onClick, and then on that onClick function, what I want you to do is change the H1 header, so change title. All right, so here's what happens within our code. When this happens within our code, our virtual DOM renders goodbye, Victor. And then a comparison happens, right? Every time we change something that has to do with the state or has direct state value into it, which we'll go into talking about which type of hooks we can utilize to alter the state, this comparison is going to get triggered. So then React is going to look at both of these. And it's going to say, hey, are these the same? And if they're not, then what it's going to do is it's going to overwrite the original DOM by basically copying and pasting the virtual DOM and getting rid of the original one and turning the new version into the DOM. Does that make sense to everyone? Right, so it creates a copy. After it creates a copy, if something changes the state, it compares the DOM that's already being rendered on the browser, the DOM that's happening virtually. And if there's a difference, then it changes the one on the browser so that it looks exactly like the one in the virtual. Does anyone have any questions over this?
Yeah, Francisco.
Go ahead,
So
Andrew.
the virtual becomes the kind of the default DOM. Am I reading that? Am I understanding that correctly?
So by default, do you mean like essentially the go-to, the master? Like if
Yeah,
when yes, the virtual DOM becomes kind of like the dictator, right? If it anything that
yep,
goes through the virtual DOM is what the DOM will become. Of
got it. Thank you.
course. Cody?
So you said it makes a comparison with the actual DOM compared to the virtual DOM, but never specified when it makes that comparison.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it makes that comparison anytime you interact with something that has to do with state. And with state, we're going to be utilizing hooks that have that built-in functionality so that whenever that hook is triggered, it knows, hey, this is changing something on the virtual DOM, and we have to run this comparison. And that's where the hooks of useState and useEffect come into effect.
Okay, so hooks are what trigger a comparison.
The state change is what triggers a comparison, and the state change is triggered by the hook.
Oof. Okay. I'll hold on.
All right. It might be easier to swallow once we start going into useState. Okay. There are no other questions, so let's go ahead and start going into some code here. We're going to go ahead and pull up our browser here. We'll pull it next to each other. We want to actually start a V project. So currently right now, if I run ls, I only have my markdown file in here. So can you guys walk me through creating a new V application?
Do you want to npm install first?
I think that's after I create the application.
Okay,
Otherwise,
so
I would be installing everything, right?
create Vite.
Okay, so create V. It's going to ask me for a project name. I'm just going to name it front end because this is going to be all of my front end code. It's going to be React, JavaScript. Okay, what's next?
Now you npm install.
Okay, so it seems like it's telling me directions here, right? If I run ls here, all I have is readme and front end. So if I run npm install, that means it's looking for a node package manager. So it's looking for package.json. But package.json doesn't exist within my current directory. So where do I find package.json?
Front end.
Okay, so I changed directory into front end. And now if I run ls, now I can see I have a package.json. Okay, so now I can run npm install. Or I can run npm-i if I want to use a shortcut, which is just a flag that apparently I'm not utilizing correctly. So let's use npm install. All right, and now that's installing my React project. Now, where would I find the command to run the server?
npm run dev.
Oh, nice. But how do you know that?
It was one of the instructions.
All right.
Package.json.
Yeah, so I could open up package.json, and then that will show me within my scripts that I have a dev script for running my V development server. So I can run npm run dev. Nice. And now if I click on that, it opens up my V and React environment, and I have my React application rendering on the screen. All right. Let me go ahead and empty all of this out so that I don't have any white noise. Let's see, I don't need any of this. I'm okay with that. Don't need that currently. And I don't want any of that because that's just going to create noise. Take off all the CSS. All right. And now I just have my index HTML rendering with no code within it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is going to be useState. what is useState and why do we have it? So let's go ahead and create a useState function. I'm going to go ahead and import useState from React. And we can see that it auto-filled for me because it was able to look at the React module within my NPM package, right? So it looks inside of my package.json, finds React, and then says, oh, you want to utilize useState from React. Great. Well, what do I want to utilize useState for? Let's go ahead and just to have a quick example, we're going to make a button here. And that button is going to interact with our useState. We'll go over how it's going to do that here shortly. So I'm going to make a button. I'm going to say that it says click me. Okay, we can see that button populating on the upper left-hand corner. It says click me. And now we can utilize something like useState. And or let's make a function here. Let's say const say or show change. And let's just console.log the change, right? Let's say that this is something like, I don't know. Let's do something like this. Kind of go along with our example from what I showed you guys through TL draw, right? So here we say hello, Victor. And basically, once I click on this button, I want it to say goodbye, Victor Platoon. Just like we saw on TL draw here, it says goodbye, Victor. Well, now it says goodbye, Victor, because once the virtual DOM gets triggered and it makes that change, we want it to say goodbye, Victor. So right now it says hello. Now, when I click this button, I wanted to change the content within this division. And I currently have this variable here named hello Victor. So you would think that I could make a function that works like this. So const change reading. And I can say, maybe I can switch this from const to let. That way I could change that variable. Then I could say that whenever this is clicked, well then hello is going to be equal to goodbye, Victor. Right, so you would think that this would work. And maybe I can make this into an onClick function. I could tell it to change the greeting. Okay, well, when I click it, nothing's happening. All right, nothing's being rendered on the screen. Well, I wonder what happens if I console.log it, just to make sure that it's actually working. So let's console log hello, and let's console log hello. And let's just make sure that we have a pointer here that says prior and after. Okay, so we inspect it, we go over to console, nothing's happening. I'm just gonna refresh it just in case. We see hello Victor Platoon. When I click this button, we see hello Victor Platoon prior and goodbye Victor Platoon after. So the value of that JavaScript did change, but it's not updating on this division. Does that make sense to everyone so far? Right, I have this value, it's being set to an actual string. That value is then being rendered through HTML in this division. And when I click this onClick function, I would expect this to change, but instead of changing, it is changing the value, but it's not changing what's being rendered on the screen. Right? I'm not actually manipulating the DOM. So what other way could I make this happen?
With useState?
Yeah, I would eventually use useState, right? But I could definitely
With
still
just JavaScript
There you go.
Just
Thank-
JavaScript would use the, get element by ID and then change it, hard code it.
Perfect. Yeah, I could definitely hard code it, give this an ID, make this, I don't know, greeting. And then instead I could say, well, document dot get element by ID and say greeting. Give it inner text and make that equal to hello. Well, now let's see what happens. Now, when I click it, we can see that it changes to goodbye. Okay, so this works. But look at all the trouble that I had to do here. I have to specify all of this information in order to be able to change it. That's not necessarily what I want, right? Maybe instead, what I want is something like useState that actually triggers a React hook. Oh, why aren't you working? Oh, because hello doesn't exist, of course. So now I'm gonna make a constant. And this constant is going to take in two arguments. It's going to take in the argument in which I will reference the variable by, and then the argument in which I will reference the function to change the value by. We've seen this before, right? What is this called?
Getters and setters.
These, yeah, it could be like getters and setters, right? This one gets the value and this one sets the value. That's a good example. I didn't even think about that. So this one gets and this one sets. But this is also called destructuring, right? We're expecting whatever's on the right side of this equal sign to return an array of two objects. And we're just giving this a variable saying, hey, that first portion of the array we will reference to as hello. And the second portion of the array we will reference to as hello. So now we'll call our useState function. And when we call that useState function, we're going to give it an initial value. So let me clarify that. And that's a good place to put it, right? This is like our init method. This is what we're initializing it as. Okay, and here we can have it say, hello, Victor. Okay, great. So we have it saying hello, Victor. And we have this ID of greeting. But now we have this value down here of change greeting. Well, I no longer need a function named change greeting because I have a setter, right? I have a function that will set a value up here. So how could I set a value on this onClick function now?
Call you say hello again.
Yeah, so I could call set hello because that's a function, right? And I could give it a value. And that value could be goodbye, Victor. Okay, so now I'm going to refresh it. And when I click this function, we can see that it triggers automatically. It says goodbye, Victor, right? I click it and all that JavaScript that I had just wrote is no longer necessary because when I trigger this useState function, this is actually communicating with the virtual DOM, right? So originally we have hello, Victor. When I click on that button, instead of getting this change title, what I have is I want to utilize set hello to goodbye, Victor. Right, so this set hello function gets triggered. And then once this set hello function gets triggered, well, then the virtual DOM identifies that, hey, there's a change in the JavaScript code. And I need to run this comparison now. I need to check if the DOM is reflecting the same information that I'm holding, right? And that's happening because I utilize useState. I am changing the state of the virtual DOM through the state hook. It compares these two. It says, whoa, the virtual DOM is currently rendering hello, Victor, and I'm currently rendering goodbye, Victor. So now the virtual DOM will manipulate the actual DOM and change it to goodbye, Victor. And that's how we end up with this project. So we start off with hello Victor. This is the DOM that gets rendered originally. That's my original value is hello Victor. That's what's initialized by. When I click here, it turns it into goodbye Victor because that is the new function that I gave it to the state. And that's useState. Does anyone have any questions over what I just covered?
I have a question.
What was the hook?
The hook was useState. It is right here. And then Clarice, I believe you said you had a question.
Yes, hopefully I didn't forget it just now. Does this never makes like a permanent change in the web page, right? It's just for like changes at the moment, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's definitely true, right? This never changes the actual HTML that gets rendered. If it changes it now, like if I look at my body and I look at the division, we can see that it says goodbye Victor in here, right? But as soon as I refresh it and it re-renders my template, it goes back to hello Victor. So it never made a permanent change to my site. It is only for that one client experience, right? So a client could be doing stuff on the site, but then as soon as they refresh the site, everything that they had done would be gone and they would have to do it again. Does that answer your question, Clarice?
Yes.
Awesome. And then Derek?
Is the declaration of the variable, is it data type agnostic? Like, could you put anything in there?
Ooh, that's a really good question. What kind of data can I place in here? And yes, to answer your question in short terms, it can be in any type. That's to include null. So it could have anything or nothing within it. Anthony?
Hey, Francisco, would this work if you wrapped things in like forms, or like would it have to be each individual button has to set like, or has to call a specific function every time?
If I wrap things in forms, it might be better if you give me a scenario.
I don't know. I'm just because like the stuff that we were using yesterday, a lot of the times we use like form submit, and it would execute the app function. Like, I don't know. I guess I'll mess with it later.
Oh, I see. So to answer your question, currently I have it on onClick, but it would definitely work with a form, right? The only difference is that when you utilize it with a form, instead of setting it on the onClick function that I have on this button, you would set it on the onSubmit function, and then that would trigger this behavior.
Okay, so you could still do that. Cool. Thank you.
Of course. Robert?
Yeah, so the previous example of DOM manipulation you showed, I guess I'm just trying to keep somewhat organized here. Do we kind of like stop doing that and we use the useState example moving forward, or is there a time and place for both of these?
So you're saying when should I utilize the JavaScript DOM that we've learned up to this point rather than utilizing the useState and hooks? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's definitely a time and place, right? If I'm writing plain vanilla JavaScript with HTML and CSS, then I'm gonna have to use the JavaScript DOM, right? Whereas if I'm utilizing a framework like React, I could still utilize the JavaScript DOM if I really wanted to, but it would just defeat the entire purpose of having such a powerful framework like React, where I could do all of the manipulation that I'm trying to do through the JS DOM. I can just do it in this way, utilizing the state hooks. And also utilizing the state hooks kind of gives you like a backbone, knowing that your state is clean. So once we're working in React, like today and from now on, I would recommend that if possible, you always utilize the state hooks at all costs. Does that answer your question, Robert?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions?
Francisco, just real quick, could you explain why is it called a hook? Why, in what way is it a hook?
Ooh, that's a good. Yeah, I would have to look that one up. Let's see. Why are hooks called React? I'm sure some developer was like, oh, let's just call it a hook. Let's see. Oh, because they let you hook into the state and life cycle features from a functional component. Nice. So it's called a hook because it lets you hook into the state. And by the state, they're referencing to the virtual and the DOM. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Of course. All right. So now we've gone over how to create this information. But yesterday I was trying to show you all an example when it came to asking for list, right? So let's bring back, I think I still have that JSON data. I do still have that JSON data. Let me copy this folder real quick. There it is. So I'm just grabbing this folder from yesterday's notes. Now I'm going to bring it in to my source file. So now I have data and this tasks within it, all right? Well, yesterday we already did our task manager, but today what we can do is we can bring in those tasks and kind of extend on what we just learned. So let's say I wanted to import tasks from data task.json. Well, now I can change this, right? So that I can have a useState that will render all of those tasks. So how can I do that? Let me comment out this code here. I'll comment this one out.
Would you just do essentially that same line, like const and then the brackets, tasks, and then set tasks, and then you just do useState and then put tasks in there?
Nice. Perfect. So now I have a tasks that's been set to the task from above. Ooh, maybe I should name this something different. Maybe I should name this JSON tasks. There you go. So we can see that variable naming is also important, right? Right now I tried to name something task that ended up doing like this circular loop where it wasn't identifying that I was trying to grab the task from the JSON. So now I got the task coming in from my JSON. They're all being set here. How do I create an unordered list that will map through this state and render something on my screen? A list item for every single task.
You need the OL first, or is it? Oh, is it UL?
Oh, you want an ordered list? Let's do an ordered list. Why not?
No, I forgot my HTML. Forgot which one.
Got it. Okay. And let's see. I'll start calling on people since everyone wants to be quiet today. Let's go with food. Food, how do I map through the tasks that I just imported from my JSON file?
Wait, so you want you map the JSON task, right?
Do I want to map to JSON tasks or do I want to map through one of these variables here?
Okay, so you do, I think task dot map.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap it in curly brackets because I'm writing JavaScript now.
And then you open parenthesis, you can say task with no S and arrow function. And I believe you have to wrap it around li, right? And curly bracket and task, yeah.
Nice. Now I wonder what I'm going to have to get here. Okay, so it looks like I'm getting something on the console. It's telling me that I have some errors. Well, let's look at the error here. So it's telling me uncaught error. It's saying objects are not valid as React children. And then it's saying that I also have things without keys. So it's telling me that I'm trying to pass an entire object and render it on the screen. Where is that happening? Where am I passing an entire object and trying to render it on the screen?
Actually, I think line 12, you just have a extra curly bracket, maybe.
Line 12, let's see. Line 12, this is for my comment.
Okay.
So inside your LI, when you're doing that task, that's an object. So you'd want to access like task dot whatever it's called in that object, probably like task.task or task.name or something.
Oh, okay, so you're saying that here in list item in line 20, I'm passing in an entire object, right? So if I do task, now I'm actually mapping through it and seeing an array of tasks, right? And now if I refresh it, it looks like I'm still getting an error. What's this error? So each child in the list should have a unique key. And is this an error or what is this?
It's just a warning.
Yeah, this is just a warning, right? My application's still gonna work perfectly fine if I have this. It's not that big a deal. But we definitely want to give unique keys. So now what do I have that's unique to every task that I can utilize as a key?
Index. Unless you have an ID in that object.
Oh, well, let's see. What do we have here?
ID.
Nice. Okay. So let's add that in, right? So I'm going to add a key, and that's going to be the task ID. Okay, now let's see what happens when I refresh the browser. Now I have no issues, no warnings, and I'm effectively mapping through my useState function of tasks to set this. Okay, nice. And now let's address the other question that was asked, right? If I have a form, and in this form I have an input field, and this input field has something like, oh, well, I don't know, placeholder, enter task. And then I have a button that's type submit. Okay, so there's my button. I have a type submit, and I can grab all this information. Well, all right. How could I capture this input? Right, knowing what I know now, right? I know that there's such a thing as useState, and that it's going to capture input whenever I tell it to, and set it to a new variable. How could I change this input field so that I can capture the input utilizing a useState hook?
Give it an ID.
Okay, and if I give it an ID, I'm assuming you're referencing to utilizing the JavaScript DOM?
You can call a function with onSubmit or onChange.
All right. Oh, for the input field.
Oh no, I didn't see the button. Yeah, so it'd be onSubmit for the form.
Okay, so on submit, and then in here, I would essentially want something to happen, right? Now, but we don't know what that something just is yet. Maybe we want to essentially add something to the task eventually. But we don't know how to do that one just yet. So let's see what happens here. We have this input field, and I want to capture text. Well, let's see. Let's have our input fields have such a thing called an onChange, right? And let's just look at what happens when I trigger the onChange event. Let me clean this JavaScript up a little bit and try to clean this up. Okay, so currently I have an onChange event on this input field, all right? It's going to take in the event and pass it in to this console.log function because this is a function, right? And it's going to log to my console. It's going to identify the event. It's going to figure out where that event happened, and then it's going to grab that value. And that's what's going to be logged into my console. So let's take a look here. Let's say I put something like Francisco. You see what's going on in my console here? Is this big enough or do I need to zoom in for everyone? Okay, it seems like we're good. So we can see that as I type in a letter, it is capturing that input and then logging it onto my console, right? It's taking in an onChange value. So every time there is a change to this input, it is grabbing that event happening, that event trigger, and it's showing me the value. Okay. So now I know that if I console.log something, or there's a way for me to grab things from this input field without having to grab an element by ID. So I know I don't need that. Okay. So now, how do I actually capture this and place it onto a variable? I can't do something like let input equals an empty string, and then in here also do input equals e.target.value, right? Because that's going to fail. It's going to tell me, hey, you can't do variable reassignment within here, right? And even if I could do variable reassignment, it's not going to show me that input or capture it within the virtual DOM. So what can I do to be able to capture this input?
You state again,
Not
just for the input one.
Yeah. So let's create a use state here. I'm going to name it input, and I'm going to comment this one out. Or to make it better, let's say form input. And then we have to make a setter. We make that equal to use state. And I'm just going to set it to an empty string. Now, why set it to an empty string? Well, because when I make this input, I'm going to give the value to this input field of form input. So now when I refresh it, I have no issues. I'm good. It's telling me everything's being taken into consideration. If I type in buttons in here, it's still able to tell me when the onChange happens. But notice that it's not actually changing anything, right? As I type, it's showing me only one letter, but nothing's changing up here. And that's because I gave it the value of form input. So I'm missing a step here. What should happen when this onChange event gets triggered?
Instead of console logging, you need to do the set form input.
Nice. I need to do the set form input. So now when I press F, the onChange happens, right? And it changes the form input value to F. And that's why this value format shows me F. And I can put Francisco in here and all of that good stuff. And if I wanted to make it more obvious, I could do something like H1 here, and I could even show my form input within there. All right, so if I go to type in something, so hello, Victor Platoon, and it's showing it to me immediately because every time this onChange event gets triggered, this useState hook gets triggered, giving it a new value, and then this H1 gets new content to display on the screen. Does anyone have any questions about this so far?
Hey, Francisco, so you said when you did const at the top with form input, set form input equals use state, empty string, you said you left that string empty. Was it because you're getting the input from below that's going there?
Yes, I left it empty because it was going to grab input from here, right? So if I gave this a value like hello, then every time my page starts, it's already going to have the value of hello in there. So I want to give it an empty string so that when I refresh, it actually gives the user a chance to type in their own input.
Okay, got it.
Any other questions?
I noticed that every time for the React applications, every time you make a change with the use state, it reloads the entire script.
Interesting.
It reloads that. So if you put like a console.log, right, like right above the return statement, that console.log will be called every time whatever change, like a button click, whatever's using use state, well, above the return statement. The HTML return statement. Yeah. So what I think is happening, he's either trouble with all the default values. See, yeah.
I see what you mean. Yeah, definitely. So why is this happening, right? Why is this console.log statement happening every time I run this? Well, when we talked about the DOM and the virtual DOM, remember every time a useState is triggered or a useState effect is triggered, it's triggering a re-render, right? It's triggering a, hey, I want to change this on the DOM, so now we have to re-render our entire application with the following information, right? So every time I change a virtual DOM, it's re-rendering my entire application. And that's what's causing this console.log to show up multiple times. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. So now we have all this information. We're up to this spot. Well, what happens when I submit something? I want to add a new item into this array, right? So how can I do that? It looks like it has completed as well, so we don't need to worry about that right now. Yeah, how can I do that? How could I add this new input into this array of objects? What can I do?
You set tasks.
Oh, so on submit, you want me to do a function, the function of set tasks?
Yes.
Nice. So let's do an on submit. It's going to provide an event. So we want to make sure that we pass that event in. And the first thing we want to do is prevent the default behavior of that event. And then you want to set tasks. Okay. What do you want to set tasks to?
Could we set it to like the existing tasks and then the form input?
Nice. Yeah. And I think you're looking at the notes and that's where but essentially what we want to do is we want to utilize the spread operator, right? And let's take a look at what the spread operator actually does real quick. So let's console.log, and I'm just going to console.log tasks for now. Okay, we can see this array showing up, right? And this array has 7 inputs. Well, what if I do something like this? What happens then? Well, right now it's showing me that nothing is really happening. But what's happening underground is that now I can just place a comma here because I'm saying, hey, instead of console.logging the array itself, I want you to open the array, right? So this is actually showing me within here, I actually just have 7 indexes and then I have a task. And then I want you to add something. So let's say I just put something in there. Well, now when I go to refresh the page, I can see I have my 6 indexes or 7 indexes of actual objects. And then for that last placement, I just have something, right? Because I'm essentially making a copy of tasks and then adding a new index into it. Right? So I have that spread operator, and utilizing the same concept, well, I can do something like set tasks, utilize the spread operator to open up tasks, and then pass in a new dictionary, which ID would be, I don't know, the length of tasks +1, I'm assuming. And then the key of task would be form input. And then completed, we'll just make that false. Okay. So now what's going on, right? I go to place something inside of my input field. So I say, all right, well, here is a task. I know the input field is being taken because I'm displaying it in that H1, right? My H1 is taking my input field and it's showing it to me. Well, when I submit this, what it's going to do is one, it's going to capture the event and prevent the default behavior. That means it's going to stop it from refreshing. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to set tasks to a new array where it's going to make a copy of the original array of tasks and add the following object for my new task. And that should not have a comma there. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when I click on submit. Well, now when I click on submit, we can see that a new task is created and it says, here is a task, which is exactly what I submitted up here. Notice that I'm passing multiple arguments into this onSubmit method, and I'm doing it by placing all of those arguments within an array. All right, so once I'm done with this function of set tasks, maybe I want to do something like set form input back to an empty string. All right, so if I refresh it, here is a task. When I go to submit, it turns back into an empty string up here and adds a task down to my array.
So do you typically do this using a like a hook though? Like where that would all that logic would be in a function and then you would just do the onSubmit and use like a hook to grab it and you're just showing it there for like simplicity?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? And now I'm about to go into cleaning this up and isolating behavior so that we don't have it all within one massive onSubmit method. But to answer your question, yes, I would typically make a separate function that would have all of this behavior happening so that it's easier for me to read. And then that's when I would do this behavior that I need to do.
Thanks.
Of course. All right, so let's clean up the code here. We'll clean up the code, and then after that, we'll open the floor for some questions, and then we'll take a break because I know this was a lot of information. So let's make this onSubmit or form submit function. We know it's going to take in an event, and it's going to do pretty much all of this information, right? All of these functions, I need them to happen. So I'm going to Command C. All right. So the first thing I needed to do is I needed to prevent the default behavior. So that needs to stay. Now, instead of setting tasks like this, I'm just going to make a new variable called new task. And I'm going to set that equal to this dictionary right up here. Or sorry, this object. Oh, why don't you like that? Oh, it's because I have a comma there. Got it. So now when I go to set tasks, I can just add my new task. And then I can set my input, my form input back to an empty string. So now when I call this function, all I need to do is call the form submit function and pass in the event. And everything should work the same. So here is a task. I'll go to submit and I get here's a task as item number 8. We can see this empty back out. My H1 element is gone and it's all working within the form because I didn't have to click the submit button, but I could click the submit button if I wanted to because it's within a form. Okay, so now that I've cleaned up the code a little bit, we've gone over these steps a couple of times. Let's do a quick run through over what's happening on the actual code and what we're seeing here, just to make sure that we're all clear, and then we'll go into answering some questions. So the first thing that happens when this gets rendered is we import this JSON tasks, and this JSON tasks gets saved into a useState function where I have a getter named tasks and I have a setter named set tasks. Then it goes into our return statement. Well, it creates our form, and all of our form is happening normally. It's just an input field that has a button. And I guess I really don't need this H1 tag anymore. right? So it's just an input field as a button. Now I have this ordered list down below that utilizes my tasks, which again is a header for all of the JSON tasks that I have here. It's a getter for all of the JSON tasks that I have there. It maps through that array, takes each one of those tasks, and creates a list item for each one of them. And it displays to me each task's task value. So now we can see here that it's showing me the task value. All right. Now, when I go to create a new form, I have this input field here with the placeholder of enter task, and it currently has the value of form input. Well, form input up above, it's another use state. It has a getter of form input and a setter of set form input. And it's initialized to an empty string. And that's why this is an empty string. There's nothing in it. So now I give it an onChange function, saying every time there is a change within this input field, I want you to set the value of set form input to the value within this input field. So when I say hello, the new value of form input is now hello. And that's why it's displaying hello within this input field. Now, when I click on that submit or I press enter, it's going to trigger my forms on submit method. And it's going to take in an event and pass in the event into the form submit. It passes the form submit, it passes the event into the form submit function. And the first thing that happens is we prevent that event's default behavior. Then we create our new task by creating a new ID and giving it the new value for task, which matches whatever the user places into the form input. And we set the completed value to false, creating a new object for the new task that we're about to create. Now, in order to add this new tasks into our tasks from above, we need to utilize the setter of set tasks, create a copy of the original tasks array with the new value of new tasks. And this is what set task gets set to. It gets set to a new array that just includes one value within it of new task. And then after that, we empty out our form so that we have an empty form one more time. So now if I say hello, Victor, and I press enter, we can see hello, Victor was added as a new object into my tasks. So now I have a list of all of my tasks here. And we can see that the form input is now set to an empty string. All right, now that we did a quick cover over everything that has just happened, we got a little bit of practice with some use state. Does anyone have any questions over any of the concepts that I just covered?
I'm still kind of like honestly, I'm just still a little confused with just like how the JSON dot tasks reads it so easily. Like it seems kind of magic to me. Like I'm kind of missing something on the very first thing. Everything else though is I'm pretty clear on.
Are you talking about this?
Line 9. Like I get you have a getter and a setter, but like when you use state JSON tasks, it just interprets the JSON like very seamlessly. I feel like I would overcomplicate that I was already overcomplicating that before you wrote it. I don't know how to explain it. Like, okay, so it's going from 9 to JSON task. Like line 9 uses useState in the JSON task, and that's going down to your HTML part in the return, right?
Right.
Where you're mapping dot map. I don't know. I'll just study the notes after.
Okay. I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding your question. Are you asking like how is it making the connection between the JSON task and then rendering it down under?
Yeah, let me just hear that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so when this entire file starts rendering, it knocks out the import statements first, right? It says, okay, well, I'm gonna need all of this information as prerequisites before I can run this file. So it already has this JSON data already imported. So it knows this JSON data exists. Now, I create a variable named tasks. Draw it out. Ooh, I don't know if I could draw it out. Maybe. Let's see. Yeah, why not? Okay, so the original file renders, right? When this original file renders, before anything happens, in the background, this is going to import useState just to make sure that it works. Oh, man. And it's going to also import the tasks from task.json. Right, so that's the first thing that happens. Those are my prerequisites. Okay, so after that gets rendered, it then goes into creating this variables. So then the next thing that it does is it creates useState hooks with initialized values. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out where you guys could see this better. Okay, there you go. Okay, so it imports the useState and the task JSON, and then it creates the useState hooks, right? Which in this case is tasks and form input. Now it already has task.json. It already imported it. So now when I go to create this useState, I'm just saying that the initial value of this useState will be all of the data that's coming in from within task.json. And it's getting set to tasks. All right. It reads this, but it knows that it's not being triggered. And then it goes into rendering our actual HTML. So it renders our input field. And it renders our button. And then it starts rendering our OL. Right. So here's our OL. And then here's where the mapping kind of starts happening. So let me. Okay, so here's where I get tasks.map. And once that starts happening, that's when I start getting each one of the LI items. All right. So now I start typing in here, all right? And let's say I type in, hello, Victor. Why not? I always go with that one anyway. And now, when that happens, the event change, because we have an onChange event, changes the original value of form input to the user's input. All right, so now the original value of form input, which is right here, our useState hook, is hello Victor. When this form is submitted, so I'll make the last little post-it note here. So on submit or on submission of the form, the form or we create a new task object and add it to the original array of tasks through useState. Now, when this form, oh, how do I make this more spacious? Here we go. Now, when this is added through the original array of tasks through useState, this is currently our DOM. So what happens between our virtual DOM and the DOM?
Are you talking about the comparison?
Yeah, exactly. So then a comparison happens, right? And it says, hey, something changed on state. So we have to trigger a re-render. Well, now we have a new item inside of tasks. So a new item gets added into task. And that's how the flow of this is working. Did that help, Cody?
Yeah, I love when everything's drawn out. Some of this was like a little bit like I already knew it. It was really just like how it reads it so easily, but I think going through it again helped a lot. Like, you
Okay.
know, like how it just knows the JSON stuff's like so easily, but it works out. And I got to look at the code a little bit longer to understand it.
Oh, I see how it's able to understand JSON so easily. JSON was specifically created to interact with JavaScript. So that's why it's able to, JavaScript is so easily able to grab JSON and like interpret it and work with it.
Yeah. No, but this is great. I appreciate it.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Okay, well, we have officially hit our hour mark. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back here in 10 minutes and start talking about useState. Thank you so much, everyone. See everyone here in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. So far, we talked about useState. There's one quick thing that I would like to cover with useState, and that's going to be conditional rendering. So now, we talked about what happens with useState and how we can change these values. Now, something really cool that I like to do, or not necessarily cool, but something that I like to include in most of the projects, or I find a necessity to include in most of my projects, is to do, hey, if this exists, or if this condition is true, then I want you to show this specific element. Otherwise, don't show anything, or show something else, right? So maybe what I can do, I'm just going to make a quick header here. And what I'm going to say, so I'm going to have an H1 saying hello, and I'm going to have an H1 saying goodbye. Okay. Oh, and I can't spell goodbye. Now, I don't want both of these showing at the same time, right? I would want them to only show one, and I would want it to be my decision which one it's showing. So what I want to do is I want to create some sort of conditional to say, hey, only show this when this is happening, or only show that when something else is happening. So what I want to do is I want to write an if and else statement, but I can't do if and else within the return statement. I have to do something like, oh man, what is the correct verbiage for this? I swear I know it off the top of my head, but for some reason it has escaped my mind. I want to do some sort of conditional rendering, but the correct term, rough. All right. So I can't remember the correct term off the top of my, a ternary statement. There it is, came back. All right. I want to write a ternary statement in JavaScript. Ternary statement. I can't spell it. Ternary statement. Okay, worth a shot. Now, when we did this in Python, what it looked like in Python is something like X, if X is greater than Y, else I want you to do Y, right? That's how we did our ternary statements in Python. But now that we're doing it in JavaScript, we went over how to do this over back in week 1. Does anyone remember how to write a ternary statement in JavaScript? Ternary.
Like a question mark or something, I think.
Yeah.
You're
So
requesting a Boolean.
Perfect.
It's,
Go ahead, Frank.
I think it's Trying to look at it. It's X question mark X greater than Y. Colon. Yeah, I was a little off, my bad.
No, that was pretty close. All right, so this is essentially the same thing, right? So in this case, we're saying if X is greater than Y, I want you to render X. Otherwise, render Y. Well, it's the same thing that's going on here. If X is greater than Y, I want you to render X. Otherwise, I just want you to render Y. So we could do the same thing here, right? We could separate everything by a colon. And then we could place in some JavaScript code in between. So now let's say that this is going to be true. Okay, so because this is true, it shows hello. And if I make this false, well, then it says goodbye. Well, now I want to make this a little bit more dynamic. So what can I use to change this value every time I click a button, right? Let's make a button real quick. So button, and then say, we'll just call it changer or change, that works. Okay, so I'm just gonna make some spacing here so that we have our button. All right, so we see goodbye. And when I click this, I wanna have it change it from goodbye to hello or from hello to goodbye. So what kind of hook can I use to be able to change the value of my ternary statement, right? I want to have something that I can make either true or false. What can I do there?
Like, see if a click happened.
On click.
So what happens upon on click?
Can you do the add event listener? Then
Yeah, I can. Let's take it a step back. Before we even start going into the functionality that would go into button. Here I have not a variable, but a data, right? I have a data type of Boolean, but I want to change this data type back and forth. So I need to be able to reference that data type. How could I do that?
We need a variable.
Okay. Now, from what we've seen, we can't just create a variable, right? Because that variable won't change the state of my web page. So if I change that variable, it's not going to change anything that's happening on my actual HTML template, right? Or what's actually being rendered on the browser. So how could I create a variable that will have a getter and a setter that will change the value of this specific data type from either true or false?
We need like a useState variable. So we would do const and then I guess this would be like our getter.
Okay.
Really what we want to call the variable initially. So we could just do like, yeah, show is good. And then the other one would be the function we would call to change it.
All right.
And the initial value would be like in the parentheses for that.
Okay. And we could either make this true or false, right? All right. So now we have this show variable. We made it true, but it's not being referenced anywhere. Where should it be being referenced?
The button, maybe?
So in the button set show is where we'll reference it because we have to call the function. So yeah, let's say on click, I want you to set show. And what do we want to set show to?
Is this
To
when you want?
false.
Okay, let's make it false. All right, so now let's see. Well, nothing's happening.
We have to reference it in our ternary operator too.
Nice. So I have to change false to show. Now let's take a look here. So it's originally true, right? That's what we set it to. It shows us hello. And when I click on change, it shows us goodbye. But now what happens when I click on change again? It looks like it's continuously setting it to false, right? Because that's what we told it to do. So what if we wanted to set show to the opposite value of whatever it is now?
We set it to not show.
Nice. So now let's re-render this. When I click change, it changes it to false, right? Because show was true. So changing it to not true would be false. And now that it's false, changing it to not false will change it back to true. And that's how we do some conditional rendering. Does anyone have any questions about this? Go ahead, Eric.
So just to double check, conditional rendering is always gonna like reference a Boolean, correct?
A truthy or falsy statement.
Okay.
Not necessarily a Boolean, but something that comes back truthy or falsy.
Okay.
Right? So something that's undefined would be falsy. Something that has a no value would be falsy. Anything that has any sort of memory space, so actually has content, would come back as truthy. Awesome. Josh?
Could you give some like real quick examples of like how we'd see this in like commonly used apps or websites?
Yeah, definitely. So let's say a pop-up, right? You're working on something and then you click, you're subscribing over for an application and you click on subscribe and a pop-up populates, right? Everything in the background is still the same web page, but that pop-up that's taking in all of your billing information, that's happening on conditional rendering. When you click on I want to subscribe, this Boolean variable changes to true and it shows the pop-up for you to be able to fill it out. And once you submit it, it changes that Boolean variable back to false, taking the pop-up away.
Cool, thanks.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Okay, the last topic that we're going to touch in part 1 of our lecture today is going to be useEffect. This is starting to get a little messy, so I might clean it up a little bit. I'm trying not to erase anything that we can utilize for our notes. So I apologize if this all gets a little much. Oh, set hello doesn't exist anymore. Yes, it does. I'm just not using it. Okay, let me comment this out. And I don't need this console.log. Okay, that should take care of the majority of these errors. Let me go ahead and refresh this. All right. Okay, so now we've messed around with useState a couple of times, but now we're going to talk about something called useEffect. So what is useEffect? When does it happen? And why do we need it? All right. So useEffect is something that you can use to track behavior. All right. So let me create this useEffect here. I'm going to go ahead and import it. And when I utilize useEffect to track behavior, here's what I mean. All right. So for example, let's bring back this click button. Oh. Oh, that's not the one I want. So I have this show button saying change, but nothing's happening within it. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a useEffect hook. I'm going to say useEffect. Now, useEffect is a function that takes in a function. What does that mean? All right, how do I write the syntax of a function that takes in a function? We've seen it a couple of times before. All right, so a function that takes in a function would simply, oh, go ahead, Cody, you're about to speak.
I was thinking like line 24 or something, like you reference with the arrow function into another function.
Yeah, exactly. So I would essentially open up an arrow function, and that would open up the arrow function. Nice. So here's a function that's taken in a function. Now, in this case, let's say all I wanted to do is I wanted to console.log show. I'm going to re-render it. We see how it's triggering twice. Well, this is happening because it's being triggered upon mounting and dismounting, but we don't want that behavior to continue. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into main.jsx, and this strict mode here, we're just going to get rid of it. And now when I go to refresh, now I only get one true. Okay, so why is this happening? Why is this console.log being triggered upon this page rendering? Well, useEffect happens once as soon as the application gets rendered. So as soon as this page gets rendered, it's going to say, oh, okay, you want me to do this behavior. All right, I can also give it something called a dependency list. So this is me telling it, I only want you to conduct this console.log when this behavior is happening. Well, if I leave it empty, it's going to assume that I have to do it every time the page renders, because right now it doesn't have a dependency. Well, what if I give it a dependency of show? Right, when I refresh, it happens when the page renders, and that's expected. That's what we wanted. But now when I click on change, it's also triggering that console.log every time the value of show changes. So now if I have an empty dependency, I refresh it, I could click on change as many times as I want, but it's not going to show me anything. All right. As soon as I give it the dependency of show, then it's going to show it to me every time the value of show changes. And I could even say the button was clicked. And we can see it happening every single time that the button is clicked, because the show attribute is changing through set show. So I click the button, set show is triggered, which changes the original value of show. Once the original value of show changes, useEffect says, hey, this changed. I'm supposed to be tracking this. So because this changed, we're going to go ahead and trigger the behavior that we got told to conduct. And that's how useEffect works. We'll see a more practical example later on today when we're actually working with our API. We're going to try to create some sort of API project so that we can see how useState, useEffect, Axios, and this all comes into play all together. But for now, does anyone have any questions about useEffect and how it connects to one another? useEffect pretty straightforward. Oh, go ahead, Clarice.
So useEffect is mostly to change without reloading the page. Is that what it is?
So useEffect is to trigger a specific set of behavior upon a dependency changing. So here is my dependency. And then this is the behavior that I want to happen every time this changes, this dependency changes. So anytime this dependency changes, I can say something different. So for example, let's say if show I want to alert hello, else alert goodbye. So now I'm going to refresh it. It tells me hello. Okay, I could do whatever I want on the site. But then as soon as I go to click change, well, the dependency has now changed its value. So now the function within useEffect is triggered, and I can see it alerts me goodbye. Does that make sense?
I guess how different than like even the ternary example.
Yeah, so the ternary example is explicitly for showing content, right? Whereas in useEffect is, oh, this change and you want this logic to now happen. Let me run this JavaScript code for you in order to make whatever it is you're trying to make, right? So this is more logic oriented, where did you go? Where this is more displaying oriented. Does that make sense, Clarice? Okay. And I think there was one more question. Go ahead, John.
Can you explain again why you removed the React strict mode from the main JSX?
Yeah, definitely. The reason why I removed React strict mode. Oh no, that's not what I meant to do. Oh well. Is because when I utilize React strict mode, it forces my DOM to get rendered twice. And the purpose behind that is essentially just to make sure that, oh man, there you go. So the purpose behind that, oh, and it's not showing me right now. Let me change this code here. The purpose behind React strict mode, rendering it twice or rendering the DOM twice, is to make sure that there's no unexpected behavior, right? So this is what it renders upon mounting. So as my application is being rendered on the screen, and then this is what it renders upon dismounting, saying, okay, I rendered everything on the screen that you told me to render. I ran all the code that you wanted me to run. Now I'm leaving it alone. So mounting, initial HTML and JavaScript code, dismounting, I'm done loading any files that you wanted. And now here's your end product, mounting and dismounting, right? And that's happening within main.jsx. Now, although it's meant to help you out, I find it that it just gets in the way because I'm getting double values. And then I've also had a lot of people ask me, well, I don't understand why this is rendering twice. And it could cause confusion, right? Why would I want to see this twice? So that's where it comes in handy to just completely remove the React strict mode altogether, so that when you render it, it only renders once upon mounting. Does that answer your question, John?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions, so let me go ahead and pause the recording so that we can do a little bit of a breakout here. All right, welcome back, everyone. Before we left for group exercise, we talked a little bit about useState, useEffect, and conditional rendering, and how it all works. Well, let's start going over how to organize our code a little better, right? We're going to talk about components at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and comment a couple of things out so that we can bring back other information that we may need. So let's see, the one thing that we need is right here. So I'm just gonna bring back our form here. All right, so here's our form and our tasks being iterated through. But let's say that our task right now, they're kind of empty, right? They just have an LI item. Maybe instead of an LI item, I also want it to have an input in there. So maybe I have an input type checkbox. And maybe its value of whether it's circled or not is the task completed. So look at that. Maybe it's not value, I think it's checked. There you go. What's going on here? Why are you complaining? Okay, warning, you have provided a checked prop to a form field without an onChange handler. Oh. Okay, well then let's say that onChange. So once I change this, I want to change the event and I want to say that task dot completed is equal to event dot target dot checked. So that should take care of that information. All right, so now I have a checkbox, right? I can, oh no. Huh. Oh, this may be a little bit more difficult than what I planned it to be. All right, so onChange, how do I want this to happen? Well, I guess for now, maybe I could console.log this. Let's see what happens if I click it. Okay, so it does give me true or false. But I want to set that over to this specific scenario. So what can I do? Sorry, everyone. I'm trying to think on how I can make this this check thing happen here. Let's say I could do something like set tasks. Maybe I can map through the tasks and say, let's call it item for simplicity's sake. And let's say if item dot ID is equal to task dot ID, and I want a triple equal sign, not a double. Then if this is true, then I want the item dot completed to be set to not item dot completed. And then otherwise, I just want you to return the item. How's that? Oh, that totally broke it. Okay. What did I do? Let's see. Oh, there you go. Now I got it working. Okay, fantastic. I apologize. Let me break this down real quick. I was definitely debugging in my head. So I have this tasks array that I'm mapping through to be able to show each one of these tasks. But each one of these tags currently needs a list item, and then we need an input field to show whether they are completed in fact or not. Right? So as they come in, we can see that the value of this checkbox is whether the task is completed. And whenever I want a task to show that it is completed or not completed, well, then I need to add an event handler into that. So onChange, meaning whether it's checked or not, I want to update my task list by iterating through each task, and this is returning an array, right? So I want to iterate through each task. If the IDs match, then I want to change its completed key to the opposite of what it was. So if it's true, it's going to be false. And if it's false, it's going to be true. And then afterwards, I want to return the item. So I'm just mapping. It's essentially just doing a for loop and saying if the IDs match, then I want you to change this one property and then return the item. And I have to return in both instances because if I don't, then I'll get null for some of these items. So by returning in both instances, I'm returning the same task, just changing the values. Okay, so now before I continue going on forward, does anyone have any questions over the changes that I've made? Go ahead, Josh.
What's going on line 62? Like if
Here?
yeah.
Yeah, so again, I'm iterating through each one of these items all over again, right? And then I'm saying, hey, if the item ID, so if the task ID that I'm currently on is the same as the task ID that got clicked, then I want you to change the value of item completed to the opposite of the value of item completed.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thank you.
Of course. And I guess it would make more sense to do something like e.target.checked. That would make the most sense. All right. Okay, so now I have all of this information broken out, right? And I'm able to do this repetitive code over and over again. But as you can see already, this is starting to get a little hefty and out of hand, right? I have these functions. Maybe I want to isolate this function to something else. But my JavaScript file is already pretty big as it is, right? I already have a form on submit method. And maybe what I need to do is create components or isolate this exact behavior of these LI items. So the next portion of our class, we're going to talk about this thing called components. We see that I have a data folder here. Well, same thing inside of source. I'm going to create a new folder named components. Now, I have this folder named components, and within here, I'm just going to make a file named task item, or I'm just going to say task. That makes most sense. I'm going to call it task.jsx. And remember, everything within our Vite and React application will be in JSX, not JS. Okay, so now I make this function, and I can say const task, and I want to make sure that it's capitalized. Every component should be capitalized, just like an OOP. Turn it into a function here. And all I wanted to return, well, I wanted to return the exact copy of what I have here. So I'm going to copy this LI item and paste it in here. Now it's already telling me I have a couple of problems, right? So one, it tells me, hey, what is tasks? I have no idea what tasks is. So that's one. And two, it's telling me that it has no idea what task in general means. So how can I fix this behavior? Where is this coming from? Well, let's first try to comment this stuff out. And let's see if we can get at least our rendering working. And okay, so now I have an input field with a checkbox. We see that. And maybe here we'll just say task. Well, now I want to utilize this HTML block that I just created, which is essentially just a list item that's holding an input field and the text of task. Now I want to utilize this information over in app.jsx. How can I do that? Or I'm essentially want to use a function within a different file. So how can I export a function and import it into app.jsx?
Import name of the function from the app.jsx.
Okay, so I want to import the function of task into app.jsx. So you're saying to do import task from components slash task.jsx. Go ahead.
No, that's it. I didn't know it was in the components folder.
Oh, got it. Okay. So let's say I try to do that. It tells me that task.jsx does not provide an export name default. Well, what's happening here?
You need to export the default function task.
Nice. So I'm going to go ahead and say export default task. So that's telling this file it will only export the function of task. And that's the only function that this file will export. So app.jsx can now import task from our components. And now if I refresh, we see that it's working correctly. So now let's see if we can call this task item. So I'm going to go ahead and call task function, just like that. All right, now we can see that we no longer need this block of code anymore. Okay, so now it's iterating through the original array of tasks and creating a task component for each one of them. All right, so this is calling the function task.jsx, and it's putting in the inner HTML for each one of them. Well, now if I go to task.jsx, we can see that task.jsx is just a list item, all right? It has an input field of type checkbox, and it has the text of task. Does everyone understand this? Or does anyone have any questions regarding how I did this?
Can you just walk through it again? It sounds like you just moved the task function to task.jsx and then just called the task after you imported and exported it, called it in the app.jsx. Is that what you did?
Yeah, that's exactly what I did, right? So I just took the logic or the HTML logic that I had here in between lines 54 and 56, and I pasted it in a different file named task.jsx. But it's still a function that returns something. It returns HTML, right? So I can call that component within this return statement because I know it's going to return HTML. So every time it iterates through a task, it's going to return the HTML return statement that's within task.jsx.
Okay, got it.
Awesome.
And Francisco, is the main purpose behind that to keep your app.jsx kind of clean?
Yeah, exactly. So you want to isolate the behavior as much as possible. So the more that you can isolate behavior or keep the single responsibility principle, the better, right? Because now when I run into an error, I know if it's either coming from app.jsx or if it's coming from one of my tasks. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. Let's keep pushing forward. Well, now we can see that task is a child, right? It's not a parent. If we're talking about the DOM specifically, what would be the parent of this task?
The ordered list.
Yeah, the order list, right? So if we're talking about the DOM specifically, that's the way that relationship works. When we're talking about components, the parent of task JSX would be app JSX. All right. So the child is task, the parent is app JSX. Well, this is great that I'm able to create this information, but currently task needs to be able to say, hey, was the task completed? If it was completed, what's going to happen on change, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this is called passing data between the parent to the child. Now, in order to pass data between the parent to the child, we have to utilize something called props. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the task, or let's see, task prop, maybe that will be a better way for us to identify it, will be the task. Okay, so now we're passing into task a variable named task prop. And that task prop will be holding the original task that came from our JSON file. So now in here, we can just say props to be able to grab this information. We're saying, hey, there's props that are being passed in. Well, let's take a look at what props looks like. Let me go ahead and refresh this. Okay, this console.log statement is triggered in every single prop. And within every single prop, we can see that there is a task prop, right? A task prop is passed in, and that task prop is holding keys and pair values. Now, this is really interesting. When I look at this here, or this line, what kind of data structure is that in JavaScript?
An object.
Object.
That's an object, right? Awesome. So if that's an object, what does that tell me that I can do here in props? Right? For example, here I have task. What if I wanted to do the task title? How could I do that?
Parse through the object with bracket notation.
Okay, so we see props, right? Because that's the original thing that I'm referencing to. And then you're saying to do task props or task prop. And now it's telling me that that's an object. So I obviously need one more. Now let's just say I want the task. Okay, so now it's going into task prop. So first I go into the object of props. Then I go into the object of task props. And then I grab the value of task. All right, and that's how I'm rendering all of this information. Now, the next question is, what else can I do? What if I wanted to pass in multiple ones, right? Well, what if instead of task props, I want to say task title, and I make that equal to task.task, all right? And then I want the task ID. Make that equal to task ID. And then task completed. And I make that equal to task completed. Okay, so everything seems to be compiling somewhat. If I refresh it, it looks like I have an error. Task completed is not defined. Well, I just defined it. Oh, of course it's not. Task.completed. There you go. So now if I refresh it, still gives me a little bit of error. That's a warning. And then it says can't read properties of undefined name task. That's happening here. So let's bring this back a little bit. Let's say this is just rendering task. We can see the majority of our errors have gone away. And now when I console log props, What do I have in? I have an object with 3 keys, right? I can see if the task is completed, if the task has changed, X, Y, and Z. Does anyone have any questions on this? How did I get this object to go to look like this rather than just having one key that has another object within it? Everyone understand how I did that?
Not really, to be honest with you.
Okay, no, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, so before, when I passed in tasks into my task problem, and let me comment that out. I passed it by passing in the entire task. Right, and the task is an object itself. So now when I go to refresh, I have an object with only one key. And that one key pair value, so the value of this key is an object that has 3 keys within it. So that was the first example, and that's how I had that nested object. Now, instead of passing in the entire object, I'm passing in each individual value. And by passing in each individual value, that's changing it so that my dictionary, or my object, I apologize, now has 3 keys within it, which is the task title, task ID, or task completed. And it's also important to notice that I'm not putting commas in between any of these. I'm simply just stating them and then separating each one of the props that I'm passing in by a space in between each prop. Does anyone have any questions regarding this? Okay, so now I know I have an object. This object is named props. And this object currently has 3 keys. It has task title, task ID, and task completed. And that's all coming in from app.jsx, and I'm specifying it here. So that's giving it its key pair values into my dictionary of props, into my object of props, I apologize. What else could I do with this object other than utilizing dot notation?
You could spread
Bracket
it.
notation.
Sorry, there was 2 people talking at once.
You could spread it with the ... or with the destructuring it.
Nice. Yeah, I could definitely spread it with a ... And I wonder what that will look like, right? If I do something like this, what do we get here? Well, then that just gives me, it doesn't seem like that did what I wanted it to do. Let me see if I can do it down here instead. Seems like I'm doing this wrong. But I could definitely destructure it, right? Instead of calling on props, what I can do is I can set an object that grabs the task title, the task ID, and the task completed status. Now, when I refresh it, I don't get anything but that warning, and I could still console.log the entire object now. So task completed, task ID, and task title. When I go to refresh it, I see that I'm getting the values for each individual task. Rather than utilizing props.task completed, I can just say task completed and grab each individual thing. I prefer to utilize destructuring just because it gives me more clarity, and then it tells me like, hey, is all of this information actually getting passed? Because once you start utilizing props, you can run into some undefined problems. So now I pass in each individual property. That's great. So let's start filling in the blanks here. And here, instead of task, I would have my task title. It's gonna ask me for a child, which I don't necessarily need right now. Instead, the child would go in here. So I can say key task.id. Okay, so now I see those two changing in. Now for this checked property, instead of task.completed, what would this be?
Task completed.
Task completed.
Yeah, task completed. All right, I can see all my information being filled in. I got a couple of warnings, but that's okay. And now I can work on my event handler. Well, before, because I was at the parent level, I had to make this whole mapping function to change everything at the parent level. But now that I have direct access to task completed, I can make a child useState variable, right? So I can say const checked, set checked. I can make that equal to a useState. And that useState could have the value of task completed. So now I can say, hey, this is checked. And instead of my onChange being this long, elaborate set task thing, I can just change the one checked value for the one component. So now I can say, if this is checked, so onChange, I want you to take in the event and set checked to event.target.checked. Okay, so now let's take a look at what we have here. I go to refresh it, I have no warnings. I can uncheck and check values as I want without a problem. And the main reason why I don't need to do this entire thing is because now I have an isolated spot where if I change the checked value, I know exactly where it's being referenced and where I'm changing it. Whereas before, it was all coming from within the array. So I needed to overwrite the entire array with a new value where the target was either checked or unchecked. Does anyone have any questions over this concepts that I just covered?
Can you please show me your export and import statements one more time?
Of course. Currently on line 30, I have this export default task. On app.jsx, I have this import task, not in curly brackets, from .components /task.jsx. And if we look at the path, within the same directory as app.jsx, there's a directory named components, and then it goes into the file task.jsx.
Awesome. And then also just real quickly, one more time, how you're referencing the task object within app.jsx.
Yeah, definitely. So now that this is being exported, this entire function is being exported, meaning all of this code, right? This useState is also being exported. All of this code is being exported individually. So now when I go to app.jsx, once I'm iterating through my array of tasks that's coming in from my JSON file, I am rendering the task element, right? So this is calling the task function that I made here, which returns HTML. I am giving it a key that is unique, passing in the title, ID, and the fact whether it's completed or not. That all gets passed into the function. The function then takes in those attributes and destructures it, so it knows it has a task title, a task ID, and the task completed value. And then I go into returning and list item. This list item has an input. I made a new useState variable for the fact whether each one of them is checked or not, so that it's isolated. I reference that variable to figure out whether I am going to check the box or not. And I gave it an onChange method so that every time I change, meaning I am unclicking or clicking this box, it is changing the value of checked, allowing me to click or unclick each individual task. And then finally, on line 26, I am rendering the title of each task. And then I close the list item tag. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I'll definitely need to practice.
Of course.
Francisco, could you just scroll at the top again real quick, please?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Where are you importing? I thought you were importing a JSON.
Yes, that JSON is being imported in app.jsx.
Got it. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no questions for me, then let's do a real quick exercise all together. Just to make sure that we have our fundamentals down. So I'm just going to create a new V project here. Just going to name this one Pokemon because we've already messed with the Pokemon API this whole time, so why not? Let's go into Pokemon, install. And while that's installing, I'm going to actually get rid of app CSS and get rid of index CSS. Okay. So here's our app.jsx. Cool. All right. So now, dev. Let's make this H1. File types. Utilizing the Poke API, all I want us to do is create an unordered list of all of the Pokemons that are fire types, right? And that's available through the Poke API. So, let's see. Cody, can you please take a look at the Poke API and find the correct endpoint for us to get the list of fire type Pokemons? And while Cody's taking care of that for the remainder of us, what do we need to do in order to make that happen, right? We're going to need to make request. So what library do we need to install?
Axios.
Nice. So let's go ahead and install Axios. Okay, so I have Axios already installed. What's next?
Import Axios.
Right. So now we can go ahead and import Axios. Okay, so now we have Axios installed into our project. We're importing it, and now we need to make a request. Now I want this request to happen every time the application renders. What kind of React hook does something every time the application renders?
useEffect.
Nice. So I have to grab useEffect from React, and I have to create a useEffect. How many arguments does useEffect take?
2.
Okay. Which one's the first one?
A function.
Nice. So it takes in a function. And what's the second argument?
The dependency list.
A dependency list. Fantastic. All right. So now we have useEffect that's ready to make a call. All right. But it needs to happen every time the application renders. So does our dependency list need anything, or should it stay empty?
Stay empty.
Yeah, it's going to stay empty because it needs to happen every time I make the call. Right. And now it's just making a asynchronous call. So let's create that function. So let's say const get Pokemon. It's going to be an async function. All right. So now how do I utilize Axios asynchronously to contact the Poke API?
Const response equals await.
Okay, let's go let response equals await.
Axios.get.
All right.
And the endpoint.
Right, which I think Cody just sent on the chat. Thank you, Cody. Appreciate it. Okay, so that gets us our response. What's next?
Then we could do let Pokemon type equal response dot. I don't know how far down you have to go.
Yeah, so maybe let's take a look at our response real quick. All right, so now I made this function that's happening asynchronously within useEffect. So when I refresh this, there's no console.log statement just yet. What am I doing wrong here? Or what step am I missing?
You need a dot then.
I'm utilizing await, so I shouldn't need a dot then. But I do notice that I created this function, but I never call it. All right. So now I just need to call get Pokemon so that we can actually see this function. Okay, so now I refresh. Now it seems like this API call is happening twice. Why is that happening?
Mount and dismount.
Yeah, so how do I fix that?
Remove strict.
So I go here. I go to strict mode. And I delete it. All right, so now when I refresh, it only happens once. All right, so let's take a look here. What do we have? Well, it looks like we have damage relationships, game indices, all the way down. And here I can see Pokemon. So what's the next thing I want to utilize here? All right, go into response.data. What's the next key that I want to go into?
Pokemon.
Right, so let's look at Pokemon here. All right, and this Pokemon is an array of 102 instances. And each one of these arrays, or each one of these indexes, is an object that holds a Pokemon key with a Pokemon object and the name. Okay, great. So now I have this list, right? And let's go ahead and say that I have an unordered list, and this is where all of my Pokemon are going to show up. I have this list coming back from my response in response.data. Well, how do I place it somewhere so that once this response comes back, it will render on the screen? All right, we're going to need some sort of hook to be able to tell the state that the original value has now changed and that we need to re-render our web page. So what hook would do that? Yeah, it would be our useState. All right, so maybe we could do something like const Pokemon And then set Pokemon. And we make that equal to a useState. And for now, let's make it an empty list. Well, once this response comes back, and we can see our response here has 102 indexes inside of this list. How do I make the value of Pokemon be equal to this array of Pokemon?
Set Pokemon.
Nice. So instead of, let me copy this. And actually, yeah. So now I'm going to set my Pokemon array, all right, to have these 102 list indices. Okay. Great. Now, how do I make all of these Pokemon show up as LI items?
Map.
Okay.
And then the map.
Yeah.
Render the.
So Pokemon.map. Let's just say Pokey. And you're saying that this should then render an LI item. Okay. So what's next? So let's see what we have here. We open up the array. Inside of each Pokemon, there is a object with the key of Pokemon and then another object. So how do I make the name get rendered?
Poke.Pokemon.name.
Okay, so poke.Pokemon.name. Let's see what happens here. Pokemon.map, set Pokemon. It's happening asynchronously. Hold on. Interesting. So we can see that set Pokemon is coming back with a console.log statement, but it doesn't seem like the value of Pokemon is changing. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to create a useEffect that will console.log the original value of Pokemon. And I'm going to give it a dependency list of Pokemon so that every time Pokemon changes, I can see it. Let's say useEffect. Okay, so useEffect is working, right? It's telling me, hey, this is the original value. You have an empty list. Okay. And now it's telling me, well, now you have this in the list. You have 102 items. So maybe there's a syntax error here. Can anybody tell me what the syntax error may be?
Is it something to do with a key? Using a key here or no?
I'm probably going to get a warning from the key. But currently right now, instead of returning list items, it's not returning anything. So I wonder if there's something going on in this function when it comes to returning something.
Doesn't it return an array? And we're trying to access the array like an object.
Yeah, so we have an array of objects, right? And then we're iterating through that array, grabbing each individual object and rendering information. But the problem is this. So I currently have a curly bracket. And I'm returning HTML. So if I'm returning HTML, rather than having a curly bracket, I need to have a parentheses. And now we can see that I have all 102. And there's my problem, right? It's going to say, hey, each child is supposed to be unique. Let's see if they have an ID. They do not have an ID. So I could just pass in the index and then give it the key of index. All right, so now I can map it. It's mapping correctly. I can change this into an ordered list so that we can make sure that it is in fact 102 Pokemon. So now if I exit, I can scroll all the way down and we'll see that it goes all the way down to 102. Okay, I refresh one more time. All right. The page renders. When the page renders, it grabs app.jsx, it creates and initializes this variable of Pokemon with the initialized value of an empty array. And it also creates a function named setPokemon. That the purpose of setPokemon is to change the value of Pokemon. Next, it goes into making a request that's happening asynchronously. Well, while this request is being processed, this console.log statement gets triggered onto our console, telling us that Pokemon is currently an empty array. Once the response comes back from the Poke API, we utilize the setPokemon function to give Pokemon the value of an array with 102 indices. When the value of Pokemon changes, this dependency list is triggered and it causes the console.log statement to get triggered again. And that's why we see the second console.log statement. We see useEffect, and then we see, hey, there is 102 items that were logged onto the that is within this array, logged onto the console. We have our H1 that says fire types, an ordered list that's being rendered, and then we're iterating through this array of 102 Pokemon. We're grabbing the object within each index in the array, and we're grabbing the index. We're giving each list item the key equivalent to that index, and then we're rendering that Pokemon name by grabbing it out from the object that we're iterating through. And that's how we get our 102 Pokemon, all fire types. Does anyone have any questions over what we just did? Go ahead, Fu.
Could you explain why we use the parenthesis, not the curly bracket?
Yeah.
For the
Definitely. When you do a return statement, right, or you're making a map function, you want to do a return statement, typically you want to utilize something like a curly bracket. Or we're used to utilizing curly brackets because that's just the JavaScript syntax that we're always running into. But if you look here, this return statement, it's returning HTML, and because it's returning HTML, it uses an open parentheses. Well, the same concept applies here. This map function is returning HTML. So because it's returning HTML, I want to return it in open parentheses. Does that answer your question, Fu?
yes.
Any other questions? Everyone's fried, huh? All right. Let me go ahead and stop the recording at this point.